A Song of Ice and Fire is told from the point of view of unreliable narrators. Since they are not infallible, we cannot 100% trust their judgment, especially on things they may have biases on. The concept of unreliable narrators is often invoked in various discussions, used to support numerous theories, and argue in favor of predictions and readings of the story. The problem is, most of those invocations of the unreliable narrators do not make sense, are used incorrectly, or place too much importance on that very concept. Before we start, remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. While you were probably taught about the various types of narration in school, I feel like a good refresher may be in order, especially because A Song of Ice and Fire is a bit unique in how it approaches it. When a story is written, the author can choose from a wide range of what we call voices. The most common voices that you've probably seen while reading are third-person and first-person voices. It's obviously very easy to distinguish them. Third-person voice describes the actions of the characters as she did, he went, they played, it moved. A very common attribute of third-person narration is the fact that it is omniscient. An omniscient narrator is likely the oldest form of narration, already found in Homer's Iliad. As the name suggests, the narrator is an omniscient being. It knows everything, usually shows no judgment towards the characters or events of the story, though not always, and may potentially have access to the thoughts and feelings of every single character as well. Not every third-person narration is omniscient, though. First-person narrator describes actions as I did, I went, I played, I moved. The narrator is a participant of the events they describe. I was curious whether there exists text written from the first-person omniscient narrators, but apparently nobody has ever thought of employing such a strange technique. Well, here's a new and unique idea, I suppose. While these two are the most common techniques, other types are possible. For instance, Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides is written from the first person plural. We went, we did, we talked. There are also texts written from a second person. You did, you went, you played, you moved. I personally most often see those in self-insert your name fanfics. I have a browser extension that substitutes your name with Phoenix. Don't at me. A Song of Ice and Fire is written from a POV manner. That is, we have multiple narrators who describe the events they see. They are not, however, omniscient. They are limited to their own perception, and that perception is not infallible. While the third-person omniscient narrator was the preferred mode of narration for a long time, now it seems to be far less common, and more authors employ what is called deep third. David G. Brown describes it as such. The narrator uses he, she, and they pronouns in the same way an omniscient narrator does, but the perspective is directly tied to the focal character. Whereas the omniscient narrator is external to the characters and has a distinct voice, the deep third narrator is synonymous with the focal character. Thus, I think it's not a stretch to say that, as a multi-POV novel, A Song of Ice and Fire can be described as consisting of numerous deep third voices. George R. R. Martin spoke a couple of times about his use of unreliable narrators. The lion's paw, lion's tooth business, on the other hand, is intentional, a small touch of the unreliable narrator. I was trying to establish that the memories of my viewpoint characters are not infallible. Sansa is simply remembering it wrong. A very minor thing, you are the only one to catch it to date, but it was meant to set the stage for a much more important lapse in memory. You will see, in A Storm of Swords and later volumes, that Sansa remembers the Hound kissing her the night he came to her bedroom. But if you look at the scene, he never does. That will eventually mean something, but just now it's a subtle touch, something most of the readers might not even pick up on. This is an inconsistency with A Storm of Swords, more than an outright error. In A Storm of Swords, Sansa thinks that the Hound kissed her before leaving her room and King's Landing. In A Clash of Kings, no kiss is mentioned in the scene, though Sansa did think that he was about to do so. Well, not every inconsistency is a mistake actually, some are quite intentional. File this one under unreliable narrator and feel free to ponder its meaning. Some examples of unreliable narrators are very easily found all throughout the novels. Let's discuss some of the most obvious ones. Sansa and Joffrey. Through Sansa's POV, Joffrey initially comes across as charming and courteous. However, even then some cracks appear. For example, in the Trident situation, but Sansa ignores those red flags. Thanks to the point of view of other characters, for example Tyrion, we see how Joffrey truly is and can compare and contrast to deduce that Sansa's perception of Joffrey is unreliable. Ned and Robert. Ned Stark obviously has a skewed perception of Robert since they have been best friends since childhood. Ned is seen making excuses for Robert even before the series has started. Robert will never keep to one bed. Lyanna had told him at Winterfell, on the night long ago, when their father had promised her hand to the young Lord of Storm's End. I hear he has gotten a child on some girl in the Vale. Ned had held the babe in his arms. He could scarcely deny her, nor would he lie to his sister, but he had assured her that what Robert did before their betrothal was of no matter, that he was a good man and true, and would love her with all his heart. Lyanna had only smiled. Love is sweet, dearest Ned, but it cannot change a man's nature. Because Lyanna did not have internal biases regarding Robert, she was able to correctly judge him as a womanizer whose nature will not change due to marriage and love, in spite of what Ned claims. Ned's perception of Robert continues to be skewed all throughout A Game of Thrones, though a large chunk of it slowly crumbles, and even he is able to see what Robert became, or perhaps what he's always been. For instance, even Ned thinks that Robert's hatred of Targaryens borders on insanity and is openly critical of it. Ned did not feign surprise. Robert's hatred of the Targaryens was a madness in him. He remembered the angry words they had exchanged when Tywin Lannister had presented Robert with the corpses of Rhaegar's wife and children as a token of fealty. Ned had named that murder. Robert called it war. When he had protested that the young prince and princess were no more than babes, his new-made king had replied, I see no babes, only dragon's bone. Not even Jon Arryn had been able to calm that storm. Eddard Stark had ridden out that very day in a cold rage to fight the last battles of the war alone in the south. It had taken another death to reconcile them, Lyanna's death, and the grief they shared over her passing. Funnily enough, Robert used his Targaryen grandmother to justify his claim to the throne, and Ned, who was infinitely more harmed by Targaryens, does not harbor feelings as strong as Robert towards the former dynasty. So while Robert is not a POV, he too is unreliable about this family. Remember this cause we will discuss this aspect later. But Ned of course never comes close to condemning his friend, always believes in the best of him and considers him a great guy, even though he continuously witnesses Robert doing things bordering on unhinged, like beating his wife and having sex with girls so young that he is scared of asking of their ages, in a world that starts considering girls as adults when they have their first period. Narrators of Fire and Blood. Fire and Blood is an in-universe history book written decades after the event, based on unreliable sources and by people who had their own agendas at play. For instance, one of the narrators of Fire and Blood, Septon Eustace, actually lived during the Dance of the Dragons and was recounting the events as they were happening, but crucially, Eustace not only preferred Aegon, but actively disliked Rhaenyra. Hence, we may assume that he might try to whitewash Aegon and demonize Rhaenyra. There are examples illustrating both of these. Let's untangle them. Prince Aegon was at his revels, Monkun says in his Truth-telling, vaguely. The testimony of Marsham claims Sir Criston found the young king to be drunk and naked in a flea-bottom rat pit, where two gutter snipes with filled teeth were biting and tearing at each other for his amusement, whilst a girl, who could not have been more than 12, pleasured his member with her mouth. Let us put that ugly picture down to Marsham being Marsham, however, and consider instead the words of Septon Eustace. Though the good Septon admits Prince Aegon was with a paramour when he was found, he insists the girl was the daughter of a wealthy trader, and well cared for besides. Moreover, the prince at first refused to be a part of his mother's plans. My sister is the heir, not me, he says in Eustace's account. What sort of brother steals his sister's birthright? Only when Sir Criston convinced him that the princess must surely execute him and his brothers should she don the crown did Aegon waver. Whilst any true-born Targaryen yet lives, no strong can ever hope to see the Iron Throne, Cole said. Rhaenyra has no choice but to take your heads, if she wishes her bastards to rule after her. It was this, and only this, that persuaded Aegon to accept the crown, that the small council was offering him, insists our gentle Septon. There are three people who recount this situation, actually. Monkun says that Aegon was at his revels, whatever that means. so he was in a brothel or other similar place. But Moon censors this fact, perhaps to make Aegon keep face. But the mere fact that what exactly were his revels is censored might point to something sinister, something of a Streisand effect. Or perhaps it was not worth recounting. That's also a possibility. Marshall presents a sinister tale of him watching fights in the child fighting pits while a little girl is forced to perform a fellatio on him. Eustace overrules Mushroom and says that this was not the case, that she was simply his paramour and the daughter of a wealthy merchant. Whenever someone mentions that 12-year-old girl, people tend to shrug it off as, OMG, you believe what Mushroom has to say? But even Eustace does not at any point deny that girl's age. What Eustace denies is the child fighting pits, not the fact that Aegon was with a 12-year-old paramour. He just adds that she was a daughter of a trader and not just some common girl. In a very similar vein, people express their dissatisfaction with Aegon raping Diana in the show, saying that it has no basis on the books. Except it absolutely does, because it is also Eustace who reports that Aegon possessed of more than healthy appetites, a glutton at the table, given to swilling ale and strong wine, and pinching and fondling any serving girl who strayed within his reach. So even if someone who was explicitly biased in favor of Aegon says that he was fond of sexually harassing mites, then what was happening behind closed doors? It's also interesting that in Eustace's recollection of events, he says that Rhaenyra is the heir and only decides to reach out for the crown when Kristen says that his and his family's lives are endangered. But then the following words are reported. Aegon II was 22, quick to anger and slow to forgive. Rhaenyra's refusal to accept his rule enraged him. I offered her an honorable peace, and the horse spat in my face, he declared. What happens next is on her own head. There is a very short time in between those two lines. It seems like my sister is heir not me and the horse spat in my face in such a short time stand in some contradiction with one another, though maybe that's just me. Now let's examine Eustace's bias against Rhaenyra. There was no way to spirit away the Iron Throne, however, nor would Queen Rhaenyra sleep until she claimed her father's seat. So the torches were lit in the throne room, and the queen climbed the iron steps and seated herself where King Viserys had sat before her, and the old king before him, and Maegor and Aenys and Aegon the dragon in days of old. Stern-faced, still in her armor, she sat on high as every man and woman in the Red Keep was brought forth and made to kneel before her, to plead for her forgiveness and swear their lives and swords and honor to her as their queen. Septon Eustace tells us that the ceremony went on all throughout the night. It was well past dawn when Rhaenyra Targaryen rose and made her descent, and as her lord husband Prince Daemon escorted her from the hall, cuts were seen upon her grace's legs and the palm of her left hand, wrote Eustace. Drops of blood fell to the floor as she went past, and wise men looked at one another, though none dared speak the truth aloud. The Iron Throne had spurned her, and her days upon it would be few. Do you see what's wrong here? Rhaenyra still wore armor when she sat on the Iron Throne, so she could not have been cut by it, at least not on her tide. Eustace included this juicy detail there solely because he wanted to make it seem like the throne rejected Rhaenyra, which is often used as a sign that someone is unfit to rule. What is funny is that HBO released a history and lore featurette where Robert Baratheon, of all people, has this to say.
And so Queen Rhaenyra climbed the steps and seated herself on the Iron Throne. Legend has it that as she left the hall later, blood trickled down her legs and hands, proving the Iron Throne had spurned her. Nonsense. It's a chair made of steel blades. Rhaenyra had wanted it all her life and had sacrificed 2 sons for it. She likely gripped the damn thing too tight.
Listen, if Robert Baratheon is able to call bullshit on this, then you don't have an excuse. There are, of course, multiple more instances of unreliable narrators, but if I discussed them all, it would take eternity. Unless you want it, in which case, let me know in the comments and I will do a part 2 where it's just a deep dive into it. Unreliable narration is indeed great as a storytelling device and adds a certain flavor that is lacking when we have an omniscient narrator. For example, it works well for various plot twists, since characters themselves are often as much in the dark as we are. It also adds important bits of characterization to certain characters. However, one crucial yet oft ignored thing about unreliable narrators is that we are always or almost always able to decipher the truth sooner or later if we pay attention and use our brains. That is the core of the unreliable narrator. It's there to make us think about what we read and consider characters' personalities, their motivations and biases before we buy fully into their judgment. Another crucial thing is that an unreliable narrator does not mean that a character is straight up delusional and does not perceive reality correctly at all. About the most delusional POV is Cersei, who, rather than to accept that she gained weight, believes that her handmaids are shrinking her dresses. We don't have a single character who would warp reality so much that everyone, including themselves, is drastically different from what they see and actually are than in their perception. However, the opposite is often assumed about the unreliable narration. In my humble opinion, A Song of Ice and Fire fandom vastly overstates the significance of unreliable narrators and overuses this concept while analyzing various theories and speculations. Rather than to use it as a mental exercise, and rather than to try and earnestly uncover the truth, the unreliable narrator becomes a useful tool to argue in favor of just about everything, slapped there for the sake of the suspension of disbelief to hide some smaller or bigger holes in one's analysis. Let's discuss some more examples. In universe, most people remember Rhaegar Targaryen in an exceedingly positive way. He is also said to be remembered fondly by the common people of Westeros. To balance this, the only person to have extreme hatred towards him is Robert Baratheon. Rhaegar is one of the more disliked minor characters in the story, in spite of the text painting a fairly positive picture of him. People tend to buy into Robert's perception of Rhaegar verbatim, even though Ned himself comments that Robert is going too far with his hatred of Targaryens. Once you point out that other characters do not share Robert's view, you know what you can expect. They are unreliable. Jon Connington can't be believed because he was in love with Rhaegar. Cersei can't be believed because she was infatuated with Rhaegar. Barristan can't be believed because he was close to Rhaegar. The common people can't be believed because it's Barristan who says that the commoners loved Rhaegar and he can't be believed and is unreliable. Do we have a character who has no reason to lie about Rhaegar? We do. That's Ned Stark. The common narrative around Rhaegar is that he kidnapped his beloved little sister and raped her. But for some reason, Ned does not have any negative thoughts about Rhaegar. In fact, he has a thought about him that, in my eyes, borders on positive. That Rhaegar does not strike him as someone who frequented brothels. The bar is in hell for Westerosi men, but this also seems to be in contradiction to the claim that Rhaegar kidnapped and raped Lyanna. If Rhaegar was not the type to visit brothels, then why would he do that to Lyanna? That seems to stand in contradiction. I think that even more damning is what Ned does not think of Rhaegar. This was a man who, per the popular narrative, did unspeakable things to his sister, and yet he does not hate him. I saw two separate people claim that Ned is to some degree biased on Rhaegar to explain his lack of negative thoughts, but in both instances, the reasoning is very murky. He does not think of Rhaegar badly because of Jon Snow. But literally, so what? If anything, he should probably have stronger feelings about Rhaegar, given that he has his kid in his house, a constant reminder of what was done to his sister. Unreliable narrator argument is very often used against Daenerys Targaryen, even though her very first chapters show that, even at the ripe old age of 13, she is exceptionally observant. They are your people, and they love you well, Magister Illyrio said amiably. In holdfasts all across the realm, men lift sacred toasts to your health, while women sew dragon banners and hide them against the day of your return from across the water. He gave a massive shrug. Or so my agents tell me. Annie had no agents, no way of knowing what anyone was doing or thinking across the narrow sea, but she mistrusted Illyrio's sweet words, as she mistrusted everything about Illyrio. Her brother was nodding eagerly, however. In fact, when asked about who is the most unreliable narrator, more than 700 people agreed that it's her, and it seems to be the most voted answer as well. I have heard somewhere that Dany is never shown in a POV other than her own, meaning her interpretation of things could be different from reality. The phrasing of it is already pretty puzzling. I have heard somewhere. Should this not be a conclusion one came to while reading the story? Well, no, because it's simply not true. Straight up false. We see Daenerys from other points of view several times. This was actually pointed out in the responses, that there is Barristan POV in her proximity, but it's immediately dismissed because Barristan only gets a POV when she is already gone. But that does not change anything. He has been with her for months at this point, and does not make any observation that would contradict Dany's views. Also, OP specifically talks about Dany's interpretation of things, but Barristan is invoked as someone who observes Dany herself, because it's usually Dany's perception of herself that's put into question. People say that they can't wait for Tyrion to interact with Dany and see her, but I'm more than sure that if that happens and he has any positive opinion on her, he too will be deemed an unreliable narrator. We have yet another POV that interacted with Daenerys, Quentyn, who throughout his journey heard terrible things about her from the unreliable slaver POV. Starts low-key believing in it, but ends up meeting her and changing his opinion drastically. Oh, Quentyn is mentioned. But it's also dismissed because the meeting itself is from her POV, and that he thinks of her positively later is also somehow rendered null and void. And we also see how freedmen talk about her. But that's also apparently null and void. What is also pretty interesting is that actually not a single example of her supposed unreliability is given. OP asks, who is the most unreliable narrator? The most upvoted answer is Daenerys, and they claim that she could interpret things wrongly, but not an actual argument on what it could be, or an example of her wrongly interpreting things. So she is judged as unreliable solely because OP thinks she could be unreliable. Nothing else. This is the argument we have heard before on this channel, in particular during a certain unpleasant incident. That we only see Dany's unreliable perception of herself, that the truth about her may be different than what she shows us, that we don't know what it's like to experience Daenerys' kindness. Except we have characters in this story who do have unreliable perceptions of themselves. Theon before his captivity, and most crucially perhaps, Cersei Lannister. We are able to contrast Cersei's thoughts with her actions and its effects. Dany is not shown being delusional about herself once. In fact, she welcomes opposition and is willing to listen to it, even working through her internal biases. Dany is actually incredibly self-critical and always questioning whether she's doing the right thing. The reason why this talking point is used is twofold. First, because fans wholeheartedly believe that Daenerys is secretly evil, and it's hard to argue in favor of this when she's fighting against probably the most abhorrent institution imaginable, and her enemies are, rightfully, comically evil. Hence, unreliable narrator is the only possible excuse they could use in this instance, to make it seem like Dany warps reality so much that there is actually nuance to the situation in Slaver's Bay. This is of course very weak, since we see practically every slave and freedman back her, while the only people who resist her are the slaving elite. People go as far as to say that she is not even backed by the slaves, who prefer to be slaves, even though the slaves are actually willing to die and go through chaos and suffering to be freed. People often cling to the things the slavers say about her, to twist it and make it seem like this is the general opinion, and not a negative propaganda employed by people who want to poison the well and steal her campaign. Second, because with the current trajectory of Dany's storyline, it is absolutely impossible for the preferred Mad Queen turn to happen. Thus far, practically everything Dany did was good or in the service of good. Destruction of slavery. If Dany is somehow unreliable and made everything up, or things are not the way they seem because we are only in her head, which is not even true, then it's much easier to argue in favor of this plot development. I would say that it's a necessary prerequisite, because otherwise it's practically impossible. Because people so desperately want this development to happen, and many are straight up convinced that not only it must happen, but that it was somehow confirmed, spoiler, it was not, that the unreliable narrator excuse is basically foundational to this belief. But once you remove yourself from this mindset, then it's probably the invocation of unreliable narrator that makes the least sense out of it all. Not only because Daenerys is perhaps the most self-critical and self-aware POV out of them all, but because the suspension of this belief would have to be gigantic. You would have to believe that she somehow lied about good 90% of the things in her storyline, that Quentyn's and Barristan's and also Friedman's perceptions of her are false, that somehow the people who have an incentive to spew lies about her are saying the truth, that somehow she did not try to sort out her internal biases, that not only is she unreliable, but she straight up hallucinates half of the things that happen in the story. Now let us for a moment return to some aspects I raised in the first part of the video. In particular, Robert Baratheon and the appeals to unreliability in Fire and Blood. It is made abundantly clear that Robert Baratheon is a piece of shit. Like, straight up a terrible person. We see that even his best friend, who is very biased on him, is critical of what he says and does. We also know for sure that the reason why Ned hid Jon's true identity was because Robert would definitely kill him. Even Ned thinks that his hatred of Targaryens is madness. And yet, this is somehow not registered by the fandom. Robert Baratheon is considered this great guy, amazing Bobby B, He's super based for beating his wife and wanting to kill a 14-year-old girl that he calls a whore. Doubts are also placed on whether he would really hurt Jon Snow. Friends, last time I checked, Ned compromised the thing most important to him, his honor, to hide that Jon is Dragonspawn, and sent him to the wall at least in part so that Robert cannot reach him. Last time I checked, Robert applauded the deaths of innocent babies because they were Dragonspawn. Please just think for a moment. Another thing has to do with appeals to the unreliability of Fire and Blood. This is something I spoke of a lot in various videos online. One of the things that is emblematic of it was something that proved that even the showrunners use unreliability as a shield for, well, their own unreliability. The clearest instance has to be Daemon killing Rhea Royce, something that decidedly did not happen in the books, because Daemon was still fighting in the Stepstones when Rhea Royce had a riding accident that was witnessed by multiple people. In order to sell a preferred reading of the character, not a truly morally grey person, but straight up an evil man, the showrunners made him kill her in cold blood, and when asked about it, they said, well, we can be sure, Fire and Blood is unreliable. And other than call obvious bullshit on this, fans bought it. Because this is very often how they analyze and read Fire and Blood themselves, by picking and choosing what to include in their analysis and readings of the story. I could go on tangent about how this is emblematic of some wider issues in transformative fandoms, but maybe another day. There are certainly more and more aspects of this story that are considered a matter of unreliable narrators that could be discussed, but these are the ones that I believe are the most emblematic of the concept of unreliable narrators being way too overblown and used for frankly ridiculous purposes. Remember, unreliable narrators are not there to trick you and pull the rug from beneath your feet one last moment. You are always able to find out the truth if you pay attention and think critically. But in order to do that, you must put your own biases away. And you know what? Taking all of this into account, I found that the audience is far more unreliable than the characters. The audience lets their own internal biases lead them to a far more substantial degree than the characters. The audience also lets others' biases inform their own, in some endless vicious cycle. And the audience uses the unreliable narrator excuse as a shield for their own unreliability. It's crazy, really. Unreliabilityception. The concept of unreliable narrators is far too overblown. It's not as significant as people make it out to be. It is used to hide glaring holes in theories, predictions, and analysis. It's applied incorrectly and selectively. In short, it feels at times like George R. R. Martin vastly overestimated his audience's intelligence when he employed it. In times I have a feeling like the only way to satisfy his audience would be to not only use an omniscient narrator, but to also just straight up have his omniscient narrator reveal everything immediately. Ned 1 AGOT should be like, this is Ned Stark, Jon Snow is not really his bastard son, Robert Baratheon is not really a good guy. Thanks for watching. Remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video.